This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 62 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Today we're talking foodie lessons from travel, so you may or may not want to listen to this episode on an empty stomach. In fact, it goes a bit of both ways. Some of the things we discuss might put you off your food and some of them might make you really hungry, so I'll leave it to you to decide when it's best to listen. Now, I love talking about food, but I much prefer eating it, I have to say. I'm not like a foodie connoisseur kind of person. I don't know all the ins and outs of food and different cuisines, but I do know what I love eating, which is kind of a lot of things. My favourite food in the world is anything Japanese, or nearly anything Japanese, and I would eat, if I had to choose one cuisine for the rest of my life, I would far and away choose Japanese right now, and that would be fine. So it rates a couple of mentions in today's podcast. Now, everyone else might have a different opinion. I'd be curious to hear what yours is. And we'll hear from three guests today who have all experienced a wide range of different cuisines around the world and have learnt some interesting lessons from it. I asked each of my guests to tell me something about some foodie lessons from their trips around the world, and they did, and they've been so interesting. So first up today is Alicia Nelson, and she talks a bit about some lessons from food in Spain and in Japan as well.
I think maybe the most important lesson that I've taken with me is that you should never prejudge a food. You should always do your best to not be that unfortunate traveler that thinks they already know what they're eating. I've been surprised a lot of times. I've had some really amazing dishes in Spain, and Spain is really good at frying things and dressing things up, and you never really quite know what you're going to get. So that's really good at challenging. Even people that are really picky that I've eaten with have been surprised. So I've had everything from like octopus in Spain, which is fairly normal, but I'm from North Dakota, and that's a landlocked state. Middle of the U.S., so lots of people here are not familiar with that. And I had cow brains in Spain before the mad cow outbreak. Just all kinds of crazy, amazing food in Japan. And the best lesson that my friend Sarah's dad taught me when he served me brains when I was 17 was just take a bite. And he looked at me as I was chewing it. He goes, "Do you know what that is?" I said, "Yeah, I know what that is." And he goes, "Well, then I'm proud of you because you ate it anyway." He said, lots of people, especially lots of Americans, don't do that. And so from that point on, I always tried to be the person that was going to be no trouble at the table. I'm lucky I don't have any dietary restrictions at all. I'm not allergic to anything. So I try to be as adventurous and open-minded as I can. And I've been surprised a lot too. I don't normally like shrimp. I don't normally like a lot of like crawfish, but I've had them and I've liked them. So you never know.
Yeah, it often just depends on how it's cooked and stuff, doesn't it? I really love that piece of advice. Just take a bite because, what's the worst that can happen is it might taste awful to you and then you don't take another one, but you might taste great.
And I really feel like the worst thing that could happen is that you're going to be rude and you're going to make a scene at the table, or you're going to distract the other diners from eating. And like that to me is way worse than me not liking a bite of food. So yeah, like the worst thing that would happen in eating, great. You try something, you don't like it, you take a drink of wine, you're done. It's fine. But to not do that and to kind of prioritize yourself over everybody else's enjoyment, I think is really, really inconsiderate. And a lot of times in the West, we don't always think about that. We think about like, oh, these are my preferences. This is what I eat and this is what I don't. But I have friends from many other cultures, and dining is so much more communal and about enjoyment together. And I just really don't want to be the person that gets in the way of that.
Absolutely. I completely understand. I remember learning really the same lesson when I lived in Japan because, the Japanese people are so polite and so friendly and so kind. And so they would offer me these kind of extremely unusual foods, and I would think, oh, I really don't think I want to eat that. But the same thing, I don't want to be the one who's impolite, and so I tried it. And sometimes it was weird, and I didn't really want any more. Often it was delicious.
Yeah, you just never know. We had some great experiences in Japan too, where we actually wandered into a Chinese restaurant, and because I did not read Japanese, I memorized a few things phonetically. I was really confused when my memorized things weren't working, and a really nice gentleman came up and he's like, my English is not very good. And of course it was perfect. And he said, but this is a Chinese restaurant. And I was like, oh, okay. And he said, what did you order? And we pointed to what we ordered because it looked enough like beef. And he said, oh, well, that's not beef. Do you want to know what it is? And we said, no, fine. We'll just eat it. And we did. And it was great.
And did you ever find out what it was?
Well, I could tell by the look on his face that he felt we weren't going to like it. And I was with my brother and my husband, and I wasn't sure how picky my brother would be. So we all just kind of looked at each other. We're like, oh, we're great. We'll just try it. And he and his wife were sort of watching as we ate, and they seemed, not proud is not the right word, but they seemed happy that we ate it and enjoyed it and didn't worry about it.
Yeah. Pleasantly surprised that it went down okay, perhaps.
Yes. So, I mean, anytime that I can be the tourist that's a pleasant surprise, I think is a good thing.
I like Alicia's idea about trying to be the tourist who is a pleasant surprise. I think that's something I try and do as well. Even if I'm quite concerned that I won't like something, I do give it a good go, just mostly to be polite, and because I have learned over time that often it turns out to be quite tasty. So, especially in Japan, I did confront a whole lot of really unusual foods. So it was, this is something that came up quite often, but nearly always it turned out to be quite tasty and sometimes extremely tasty. Now, while I think of it, I must confess to a current TV addiction, which is related to this. It's not completely random. So it's screening on Netflix here, and I believe it might be screening on Netflix in many parts of the world. And if you haven't discovered it yet, it's Midnight Diner Tokyo Stories. And it's a series of, it's an episodic show about a diner in the middle of Tokyo, which only opens from midnight until I think 7 a.m. And of course, at that time of day, night, it's got a constant stream of particularly interesting visitors, and it tells their stories. And each episode is named after one particular Japanese dish. So I just watched the rice episodes, like rice in an omelette, and it was just gorgeous. So it's sort of related to this episode. Do go have a look, and you can learn a lot about Japan and the Japanese culture by watching Midnight Diner Tokyo Stories. Highly recommended. Now, my second guest today is Zoë Dawes, and she has lived and worked in many interesting places around the world and travelled to many more. And during these travels, she has certainly experienced some very interesting foods and learnt a lot from them too.
I do genuinely believe if you can try the food, find out how it's made, who makes it, you really do start to get to know the people. And that is the same whether it's a village nearby that produces fantastic bread or, a national dish. But one of the lessons that sprang to mind when I was thinking about it, I used to live in Hong Kong, and, Hong Kong is a foodie capital of the world,
for sure.
Food. Yeah. And I was blown away by it because I had lived 4 years before in Greece, which I have to say in the 80s was not the foodie capital of the world by any means.
That's true. That's my only experience of Greece is in 1985. And yes, it wasn't very foodie capital, no.
No, I'm glad to say that things have changed. But it's still, even the Greeks themselves would not profess to be, in the top 5 food destinations of the globe. Hong Kong, on the other hand, yes. However, my Chinese colleagues would delight in taking us out for lunch, the Western colleagues, and then asking us what we'd like off the menu, and then seeing what we ordered and seeing how brave we were as to whether or not we were going to order the octopus tentacles, which I'd had in Greece, so that wasn't a problem. But maybe jellyfish tentacles, not so sure. Ooh. Chicken's feet, I can remember being at a banquet where a live snake had its stomach slit open, and I can't remember which bit of it God, heart. I don't know what was inside that they took out because by that time I wasn't looking.
I
But it
don't
was an
blame you.
Aussie. Well, I have to say, Amanda, it was an Aussie colleague of
Oh no.
mine who was the one they offered it to because they knew he was the most likely to say yes. And he was the guy that it was because it was a great honour to have this bit of beating heart or whatever it was given to you. And eventually I kind of said to someone, a Chinese colleague that I knew well, I said, look, I'm embarrassed because actually some of this stuff, I'm sorry, but I really, really don't like it. And she said, oh, don't worry, Zoe. She said, we know you don't. She said, we just like to see how far you'll go in being polite.
Oh no. It's all a game.
It's a game, exactly. How far will the rest of it go to not offend Chinese colleagues? So after that, they'd be trying to get me to eat all sorts of stuff. And I took great delight then in saying, oh, thank you so much, but I don't really think it's for me. And they were fine. So I think one of the lessons I learned, and I do it even today, if they offer me something that I'm really not keen on trying, I've been around the block enough times to know that I don't want a gag reflex when
No.
I'm eating. So from that point of view, it is just say no if you really don't want it. But on the other hand, there is that thing of, unless you really feel, I think sea slugs was one that I definitely wasn't going to go and try.
Oh, I'm with you on the sea slugs.
Mm-hmm. And I have to say, Australia was where it was tested because I was in Uluru, fantastic experience, and I did a bush tucker walk, which was brilliant and really interesting. And our Aboriginal guide was so informative. And oh God, you really realised, life lived on the edge with that climate and so little. Yeah, them able to find so much, but. Yeah, I wasn't going to do the Wichita grub, and I have no regrets about that, Amanda. I'm sorry if it insulted Australian heritage. And, others did, and that was fine. So, yeah.
I don't blame you. I have never tried a Wichita grub either, and I really don't want to.
There we go.
So it's okay. I'm not offended.
Oh, thank you. But actually, most of the time, yeah, just try something, even if you don't think, it's for you, then just give it a go. Your mind is opened to so many different sensations when you're trying different food, and the culture that is linked to making that food. I find I'm most interested in the stories behind how did people come to create that dish or to bake that cake or whatever, and so much of the place that you're in can be discovered when you look into the actual cuisine of the place.
I think that Zoe's quite right that most of the time it would be polite to eat unusual foods that you're offered, but if you really, really don't want to try it, it might be, I don't know, for example, I really don't think I could be convinced to try something like horse meat, then it's okay to politely say no. And a lot of the time, or probably nearly all of the time, the hosts won't be offended at all. Like Zoe explained when one of her Hong Kong hosts confessed that they were just really trying to see how far that they could push the foreigners and how long they would be polite and keep eating things. And I was thinking about that in our own context here in Australia. Now we have this, horrid black spread called Vegemite that we put on toast. We say horrid, but I love Vegemite. It's like my go-to food if I feel ill. It's a yeast extract similar to Marmite or Promite, if those things mean anything to you. But when we have visitors from abroad, especially from countries, non-English speaking countries where they don't have any of these kinds of spreads, then we always get them to try Vegemite. And really, it's a sport. We're just doing it to see the terrible expression on their face. And I always remember when I was teaching ESL, one of my students came in one day to tell me this story, and his particularly mean host family, I really should say, had said to him, I think he was Swiss actually, I think they had said to him, oh, it's just like Nutella, and so he was expecting this, sweet chocolatey spread, and he spread it thickly on his toast. You should never spread Vegemite thickly. It's very strong tasting. And took a big bite and, of course, got this massive salty shock. And, I laughed a lot. And really, that's the whole point of it, is that we're really just trying to laugh at people who decide that Vegemite is not for them. But we're certainly not offended if you say, no thanks, I don't want to try it. So that's an interesting lesson as well. Now, my final guest today is Yasmin Newman. You may remember her from a couple of episodes ago, speaking about her indulgence in French patisserie treats. And today she's still indulging, but we're talking about New York City.
Basically, this isn't my first food sabbatical. My first book, 7,000 Islands, came to life in much the same way. I lived and travelled in the country and explored its history and culture through its food. And a few years after that, I spent another 6 months in France, staging at different patisseries and sweet venues throughout the country. And I dedicated a few weeks to eating every single dessert in Paris as well. And I guess that these are the extreme examples of food adventures, but it's kind of really how I take on any new city or new country. For me, food is very much a gateway to travel and to new worlds. So I guess it's always been a goal of mine, or will be, to do these kind of food sabbaticals every few years. And, when my husband and I discussed another adventure before kid number 2 arrived, and this time in New York to visit my brother, this idea of another sweet adventure, was kind of hard to resist, because for years I'd been watching on as New York raised its sweet game with creations like cronuts and crack pie and compost cookies, and these amazing chefs like Dominique Ansel and Christina Tosi, and they were dreaming up all these wild new creations. And yeah, as a self-respecting food lover, I wanted a ringside seat on the action.
Sounds amazing.
So we thought, why don't we just stop work, hang the expense, go spend a sweet season in New York with my brother, and I'll write a book about the adventure, and would have be complete with a guide and recipes, and it could act as a blueprint for others to follow or experience from home. So that's really where it all kind of came about from.
Yes, and as you said that, yes, why don't we do this? Yes, exactly. Why not? Like, it's an adventure of a lifetime for your stomach.
Well, exactly, and I think that's another kind of thread to the book that I hope people take away. Your dream might not be to go eat desserts to your heart's content in New York, but whatever that dream might be, take the time to stop life and to go and experience. I've always been enamored with those tales of food or adventure, like Eat, Pray, Love, Under the Tuscan Sun, A Year in Provence, where people have kind of just followed this niggling little itch and thought, why don't I do this? It would be so much fun.
Absolutely. And I think you're right. A lot of people just might have an idea but think, it's too hard. But it's not like you've given up your whole life to do it. You managed to find 3 months to do it in a time that suited. Obviously, doing it in a financially sustainable way. It's often not as impossible as we first think it might be.
Exactly, and I think when you set everything into motion, it's there's challenges along the way, but that kind of adds to the excitement, and then you realize it wasn't quite half as hard as you thought it would be. And I also think those missions allow you to do something that you wouldn't ordinarily allow yourself in every day. For example, I don't eat that many desserts every day. I would like to, and I do eat a lot of dessert, but not 4 to 5 a day, which is about my average over there. But it was so fun to know that this is what I'm doing here. This is my purpose, and it's okay. Like, it's okay that I got really chunky, and
it's not forever.
And it's not forever. And yes, I acknowledge it's very unhealthy, but it's great for the soul, and there's an endpoint in mind.
Yes.
So just kind of immersing yourself in that experience, just heightens it almost.
When you left New York and finished up with this dessert sabbatical, did you then never want to eat dessert again for months, or did you have to kind of wean yourself off the idea?
I would have liked to have thought that I would be over it. After my first, after writing 7,000 Islands, which was on Filipino food, and that's I don't know if you know much about Filipino food, but it's very rich and indulgent.
Right.
A lot of fried foods, which I also love.
Me too.
It took me a good while to kind of get back into eating some of those foods because it was just so intense.
Right.
But that did not happen to me with desserts.
That's a
much
shame.
to my surprise. No, I mean, when I came back and when I was in New York, I was also doing a lot of recipe development and testing. Complete with the book, there's about 40 inspired recipes plus some chef contributions. So I was, obliged to keep cooking and eating.
It's a tough
but
job.
even after, it's a tough job. We put our body on the line, us journalists. But I have been very surprised, even now, months after I finished, that I'm finding it hard to wean myself off this dessert habit. I said earlier that it's nice to give yourself these 3 months of indulgence, but now my mind thinks that one is allowed to eat many desserts a day, and that's been hard to give up.
Oh dear, yes, I think that's my fear. If I did something like that, I would find it hard to go back. Now, I'm sure it's a trite question to ask, which was your favourite dessert in New York. So I'm going to ask, if you could have one of those New York desserts again right this minute, which one would you feel like?
It's a cookie from a bakery called Levain, and it could be the best cookie in the world. And I've had a fair few cookies. It's quite classic in a way in that it's not got these outlandish flavors. I mean, they've got 4, your classic chocolate chip with walnut. There's a double chocolate chocolate chip, chocolate peanut butter, and an oatmeal and raisin. And these are all kind of very classic American cookie flavors. But it's I guess the engineering of this cookie. Most big cookies are kind of quite disc shape, so you can have a big one that's very round but it's flat. This one is like a dome. It's almost like half a baseball.
Wow.
And everyone online is trying to replicate this cookie, and I also have developed my own take on it, but it's not particularly easy to have height and structure in a cookie. So when not to bore you with the science of baking, but when you know that kind of backstory, it makes you appreciate this cookie even more because it's kind of crusty on the outside and all gooey on the inside. And
yum!
It's just simple delight. No, it's not simple. It's just heaven. It's just heaven.
Wow. I knew this was going to be a terrible mistake talking to you before lunchtime.
I'm just making myself hungry actually right now.
Yasmin's tips on some amazing desserts to eat, and I really want to go to this Levain bakery in New York now and try the best cookie in the world, are all very important. But I think her non-foodie lesson in our chat just now about following your dream is really important. So I think a lot of people think, I'd like to go here, I'd like to do this, I'd like to see this or travel here. And it's easy to put up barriers to say, I can't do this because, or that's impossible because. And sure, we can't all up sticks and head, on an endless two-year long world trip or whatever. But a lot of the time, the barriers that we put up may be easier to break down than we think. For example, when I moved to Japan, people even tried to put up barriers when I'd already decided I was going. They'd say to me, oh, you can't leave this career, you can't do this, why would you want to go there, why do that, etc., etc. But, it was one of the best moves I made in my life. And fortunately, I kind of realized ahead of time that I desperately wanted to do it, and I was happy to leave my so-called, great job, etc. But, it's easy to be talked out of it as well. It reminds me of Mike Campbell, who's been a guest on this podcast and runs the Live Immediately podcast. And he and his wife and daughter sold all their stuff and spent a year house sitting in the US. And I'm sure a lot of their friends said to them, what are you doing? This is crazy. You can't just leave. But actually you can. So if you want to go to New York City and eat desserts for 3 months, which I have to say is a very appealing prospect, think about it. Maybe you can. Or, maybe your smaller version of whatever it is. But do think about that lesson from Yasmin. So anyway, thank you very much for listening to episode 62 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. I'm not sure if it's made you hungry or the opposite, but in any case, if you have any foodie lessons you've learned on your travels, come and share them on Facebook. We have a group of great people chatting away at Thoughtful Travellers on Facebook. So there's a link in the show notes, or just search for Thoughtful Travellers on Facebook. And you can also look up some of my guests' links today to find out more about them. For a start, we had Alicia from the Prairie Style File, and she's at prairiestylefile.com. And she's written a book not about food, but about beer, something very important to go with food. So you can see her book, North Dakota Beer, A Heady History. After that, I spoke with Zoë Dawes of The Quirky Traveller. So you can find her at thequirkytraveller.com or on Twitter or Instagram at Quirky Traveller. So much good stuff there. She's been at that site for a long time, so there's lots of great content. And finally, I spoke with Yasmin Newman from yasminnewman.com, and I heartily recommend The Desserts of New York and How to Eat Them All. It's a great book which includes recipes for some of these amazing, amazing desserts that she discovered in her 3-month dessert sabbatical. Who doesn't want to go on a dessert sabbatical? That is going on my list of things to do one day. You can also find Yasmin's book about Filipino food in the show notes as well. It's called 7,000 Islands. Excuse me, my voice is actually wearing out. It's winter over here in Perth, and I have had a cold this week thanks to my son or someone who passed the cold germs on to me. But thank you very much for putting up with it, and I hope to have you back listening again next week. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.